Welcome to Macro Pulse. This week we'll be looking at the breakdown in relations between South Africa and the US. We'll be looking at the most recent Trump tariffs and also on the impact of these things on markets. Now let's start with the US-South Africa relationship. Over the last few years, this relationship has been quite rocky. We've seen under the presidency of Cyril Ramaphosa, as well as under the Democratic and Republican House, that relations have soured. But there's been a series of events that has led to this. First of all, South Africa's foreign policy stance towards the Ukraine-Russia war, the Lady R incident, where we had a sanctioned Russian ship docking in Simonstown. We also had the Taiwan embassy that now has to relocate from Pretoria to Johannesburg. The closeness with Iran and South Africa's role in getting Iran to become part of the BRICS membership. And these things have led ultimately to push South Africa, in the US's minds, more towards the global south. However, more recently, it seems that the land expropriation bill has been the catalyst for Trump to impose actions on South Africa. But this also isn't new. In 2018, we also had Trump commenting about the land reform policy that South Africa was embarking on. Other members within the Trump administration has also criticized South Africa. Elon Musk, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, they've all come out and spoke out against South Africa. And recently, Trump has signed an executive order against us, accusing South Africa of human rights violations as it pertains to the land expropriation bill, including government policies around education, employment, and business, but also accusing us as a national security threat because of our relations with Iran, China, Hamas, and Russia. These are all serious allegations, whether we agree with them or not. So the question is, what are the immediate risks? First one is obviously the reduction and the halt of aid towards South Africa. A lot of this aid goes towards health services, and cutting this aid will have repercussions. Secondly, there remains the risk of South Africa being excluded from AGOA. Later this year, there will be an AGOA review, and South Africa does have preferential treatment to trade with the US under this agreement. There's also the FATF grey listing, which is coming up by the middle of the year, which we hope to get excluded from. And then the G20 presidency, which South Africa is hosting this year, is also key. If Donald Trump or other Western nations doesn't turn up for this G20 event at the end of the year, it may be seen as a foreign policy embarrassment. Fortunately for South Africa, we have a very diverse set of trading partners. We export about 10% of our goods to China, about 8% to the US, 7% to Germany and Japan, 5% to the UK, and more than 10% to African nations. Now, within that 9% that we export to the US, only a quarter of those falls under the AGOA agreement. And the AGOA agreement is agreement with African nations, more than 30 African nations, by which the US grants preferential treatment and preferential terms to Africa to export to the US. The risk is that in 2025, with the review of AGOA, either South Africa will be kicked out of this agreement or that this agreement will be completely renegotiated. Nevertheless, some sectors in the country is exposed to that risk, in particular the auto sector as well as the agricultural sector, which does export a lot of its goods under this agreement to the US. In our view, however, we think although it's negative, it will be manageable because ultimately only less than 1% of our GDP is exposed under the AGOA agreement. And in terms of tariff saving, we are only saving about 2 billion rands a year on the AGOA agreement. So the negative headline might persist or come through, but we think economically we will be able to manage the situation. But what does Trump really want? Does he just want to flex his muscle against a weak opponent? Or is there something that he wants from South Africa and wants South Africa to sit on the negotiation table? We think there's a couple things that could ultimately be interested for Trump. First of all, we think that the relationship that South Africa has with Russia and Iran is one that the US may want us to step back from. Secondly, we think a renegotiation of the AGOA agreement with better and more preferential terms for the US in terms potentially of also getting minerals from South Africa is on the table. And thirdly, also better access to invest in South Africa without the government's policies. If indeed that is the case, and South Africa is willing and smart to negotiate, we may ultimately end up at a better position than we are at the moment. In the meantime, South Africa is sending a delegation to the US to go and talk to policymakers on that side and to go and explain the policies of South Africa, which we see as a positive sign. So where are we with tariffs? Well, during Trump's campaign, he was very vocal about tariffs. But during his inauguration speech, he mentioned very little about it, which the market took as a positive signal. But towards the end of January and into February, he proposed to put tariffs on both Mexico and Canada of 25% and 10% on China. Since then, he has decided to delay his tariffs on both Mexico and Canada, but continued with his 10% on China. That delay will now be reviewed at the beginning of March, so that risk is still out there. He's also come through and said he wants to put a 10% tariff on steel and aluminium imports into the country, and he is now focusing on potentially bringing in reciprocal tariffs, which means that if a country tariffs the US at a certain rate, the US now will make sure that it tariffs that country at that same rate, only if that rate is higher than the US rate. This ultimately may work out to be better than the 10 to 20% universal tariff that the market was feared. Because this reciprocal tariffs, the increase in that will be less than the 10 to 20% in most cases. So this may ultimately lead to a better outcome than the market initially feared. And therefore we think Trump's ultimate objective with tariffs is more around what he wants to achieve in terms of other policies, rather than getting revenue into the system. We also think that Trump is still constrained by the magnitude and the potential impact of tariffs on both growth and inflation. The tariffs that I explained earlier on Canada and Mexico and China that he proposed at the beginning of February, if those were to go ahead, we would have seen an impact on inflation in the US of up to 0.5% and a negative impact on growth of up to roughly 1%. Also, we would have seen close to or more than 2% impact on GDP in both Mexico and in Canada. So clearly close to recessionary levels if those were to have been imposed. So we think the inflation and growth impact remains a constraint towards the US at a time when the US is actually growing at a decent pace. If we look at the most recent non-farm payrolls, it shows that the economy is doing still fairly well. What are the impact of these both tariffs and the relationship between the US and South Africa on current markets? Well, if we look at the rand has been quite resilient. Over this time frame, the rand has actually remained steady, and since Trump has started to make noises about the executive order and accusing South Africa of human rights violations, the rand has actually slightly appreciated. Bond yields, however, did go up slightly, so the bond market came under a little bit of pressure, but the equity market did fairly well, apart from general retailers and banks that remains under pressure. The resilience in the rand could also be attributed to the fact that we have an improvement in the terms of trade, which means that the stuff that we export, the price of those things that we export, gold, PGMs, including platinum, those prices have risen relative to the price of those things which we import, including oil. And so we've seen the terms of trade improving. Now, sticking with gold, gold has done really well over the year thus far, up 10% year to date, and a lot of that could be attributed to the fact that we've seen a large amount of policy uncertainty and also the fear of higher inflation. So we've seen reserve managers diversifying more of their assets towards gold. We've also seen in other parts of the market more diversification starting to take place. US valuations are high, and US policy uncertainty is elevated. And so we've seen that some markets have started to outperform the US. In particular, European equity markets outperformed the US so far this year, and Chinese equities outperformed the US so far this year. We've also seen how the dollar has started to weaken slightly, still from very high levels, but we've seen a little bit of weakening taking shape, and we've seen how positioning within the dollar has also improved. All signs that we potentially are seeing some sort of diversification, investors starting to diversify out of US assets. Even though the rand has been very resilient, we believe one has to remain cautious. During Trump's first term, during 2018 and 2019, when we had the trade wars, the rand depreciated between 10 and 15%. Now, not all of that could be attributed to just the trade war, but the rand will remain on the back foot as long as we have a trade war and there's uncertainty and noise about trade globally. So finally, volatility and uncertainty does create opportunity, and it's important for us to remain focused on the signal and not the noise. All the best, and thank you for watching.